This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, being interviewed by Joanna at the Creative Penn. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. This is episode number 45 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. I'd like to thank Gold Shield patron Deborah Dunbar from deborah.dunbar.com, Gold Shield patron CC Jameson from ccjameson.com, and my two newest Gold Shield patrons, Larry Keaton and Vicky Tharp of vickytharp.com for their support. I'd also like to thank my newest Coffee Club patrons, Amanda Feyerabend, Tom Erb, Chris Schuler, and Kelly Garrett, as well as all of my longtime Coffee Club patrons for their support month after month. Please support all of these authors by reading their books and leaving reviews for them on your favorite bookseller's website. You can find links to all of their websites in the show notes at writersdetective.com/45. Give your fans a chance to show their support by creating your own Patreon account right now. To learn more about setting up your own Patreon account for your business, visit writersdetective.com/Patreon, Patreon. And speaking of patrons, my very first patron when I started this podcast was author Joan Raymond. Joan is a cozy mystery author that is launching her new book, Guardians of the Gifts, on June 8th, which, as I release this podcast, is tomorrow, June 8th, 2019. You can find Joan and Guardians of the Gifts at joanraymondwritinganddesign.com. I will be sure to put a link to Joan's website and where you can buy her book in the show notes at writersdetective.com/45. So if you are a cozy mystery fan, definitely give Joan's book a read. Thank you for all of your support, Joan. I truly appreciate it, and I will be putting my book order in on launch day tomorrow for sure. All right, this week I had the great fortune to be interviewed by Joanna Penn on the Creative Penn podcast. Joanna, as humble as she is, suggested I share this interview here on my podcast as well, as if there are any writers out there that aren't already listening to her show. So I say that because Joanna is one of the few podcasts that I listen to every week. Dare I say it? She has great guests. Well, normally. But she has her finger on the pulse of the self-publishing industry. She is a prolific fiction author, nonfiction author, and all-around creative entrepreneur. And I also love that she has her eye on the future. And we're also both about the same age, despite her looking a full decade or more younger than I do. Most importantly, off the air, Joanna is just as kind, funny, and genuine as she comes across on her podcast and on her YouTube channel. So you can find Joanna Penn at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N, as she says. So without any further ado, let's get to the interview.
Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com, and today I'm here with Adam Richardson. Hi Adam.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. Just a little introduction. Adam is a California police detective and host of the weekly Writers Detective Bureau podcast, where he answers questions about criminal investigation and police work posed by crime fiction authors and screenwriters, and I know everyone's super excited to have you on the show. But just start by telling us a bit more about your career in law enforcement and also why you wanted to help writers, because I'm sure you're busy enough.
I definitely am. So I've been a cop for the last 23 years or so, and 17 of those were spent as a detective. Everything from property crimes like working burglary and fraud to homicide, sexual assault and robbery. And then after some, being emotionally wrenched out after working all the sexual assault crimes. Then I went to narcotics, started having fun again, and then into a vice intelligence unit that I spent over a decade in and really loved. And then I'm also a college faculty member. And so by being a teacher as well as a cop, when my friends here in Southern California that do screenwriting, asked a few questions, it was a little bit of an aha moment to, do this as a little side project and try to help as many writers as I can.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And I know lots of people have questions, and I've been listening to your show, the Writers Detective Bureau podcast, and I highly recommend people go over there because you answer lots of different questions in detail. So we're going to try and get a few questions in today. I just wanted to direct people over there for a lot more detail. But let's start by what are the things that annoy you most, the common things that people or authors particularly get wrong about police work and criminal investigation?
So, well, there are a few things, but I want to start with what writers get right. Writers are phenomenal about observing human behavior. Most people are so busy, trying to project their own image, and they're so in their head about what they're putting out there. I think especially the more introverted writers are really good about observing human behavior. They are constantly writing, and they're obsessed with the story at hand. And the reason why I think those are great things is because it actually translates really well into what we do as detectives. So I see a lot of similarity between writers and detectives. So I think at the very least, that paves a great, parallel between the two. So the things that writers do that are kind of, I don't want to say they get them wrong so much as it is they fall into the trap of a trope that, we see time and time again. And so we just assume that they're the truth. Like the maverick that breaks all the rules, to get the job done. It's like a great detective or a great cop is somebody who plays by the rules. I mean, literally law enforcement means enforcing the rules. So to be great at that job, you have to be able to play by the rules, which goes right to search warrants. Writers, it's always like, is this a favor that they have to ask a judge, or is this something we just, it slows down the process in the story to have them go seek a warrant? I mean, if you don't get a warrant, you're going to lose that court case later on. You're not going to be able to prove it because you violated that person's rights. There are some great ways to convey that in a story that are pretty realistic, that are not going to bog down the storyline. I mean, being a great detective means knocking out search warrants day in and day out. You can even do it over the phone, like a 3-way phone call with a judge, a district attorney, and your detective. You lay out the story and you can go forth and conquer. Those small details are the things that will turn off people that are real big fans of the genre. But it's not, you shouldn't view it as a big slog or a bottleneck to the story, because you can just pay it a little bit of lip service and keep going. Interrogations. The interrogation scene, especially in episodic television, isn't about actually doing an interrogation so much as it is a whole bunch of exposition that the protagonist gives of, these are all the things that we figured out. And so I'm summing it up for the audience because I hope you were following along and didn't come back from a bathroom break too late. So yeah. So to excel with an interrogation scene, which we'll probably talk about a little later, is understanding the why of everybody that's in that room, not just the detective, but then also the suspect or the attorney or whatever. And then finally, my last pet peeve is the rank of your characters. We all have this tendency to want to have our hero be the most important person. So they're the detective sergeant this or the detective lieutenant that, or across, in the UK, especially, DS so-and-so or DCI so-and-so, like a detective sergeant or detective chief inspector. Those are supervisory positions. So, like, if you're a detective sergeant, your real job is you're running a group of somewhere between 3 and 7 detectives. You're approving overtime. You are honestly kind of in charge over, to a certain extent, the investigation, but it's really the detective that is the one that's responsible and the one doing all of the legwork. When we're talking about a detective lieutenant or a DCI, I mean, they're almost middle management. If you picture somebody with the obsessed about the overtime stats, and spreadsheets, that is a lot of time, the reality of their day-to-day job. They may actually be the ranking person in the unit, but a lot of their work is going to be administrative, not necessarily the ones that are actually in the interview rooms or at the crime scenes. For major crimes, they will go to the crime scenes, but they aren't necessarily the ones doing all of the work. So with all of that said, these details, I know, make it seem really, really daunting for a writer, because to write fiction, the great thing about fiction is you can make up everything, but then it's like when you start talking about crime fiction, there's like this other set of rules that are pretty foreign potentially, and you don't want to let down an audience. So a lot of people are really reluctant to get into the genre. But if there's anything you take away from this episode of the podcast, it's that there's a support network out there of cops and lawyers and other writers and cops turned writers. We want to see you succeed, and we're out there to really help you and to do it for free.
Yeah, and it's so funny you say that, because I did a day at the FBI in New York as part of Thriller Fest. And they were so great. I mean, there were a few stereotypes there, obviously,
sure.
The guys in the suits and stuff. But it was lovely because they said the same thing. They were like, we really want you writers to write the best, most correct type of story possible. So we really want to help. So do ask. But I want to come back on you also on the police procedural thing, because I thought I was going to write crime thrillers, and I wrote one, Desecration. And then I realized that police procedural is super hard because of all these reasons. So I then had my detective leave and become a private investigator because of the maverick trope. I wanted her to be a rebel. So what's the truth, I guess, between a private investigator and a cop? I mean, obviously one is not employed by the law, but where's the line?
Right. So that's actually quite common, and a lot of times it's because the writer is investigating that whole field, that whole career, alongside their private investigator protagonist. Many real PIs are former cops. There are a lot that aren't, but it's similar in the sense that they're working in investigation. And simply put, there's a lot of, in a former assignment, I worked in intelligence work. And so a lot of the time it was, well, what is intelligence, or everyone knows what an investigation is. So first is understanding what your goal is. And this goes back to the private eye thing as well as the police thing. An investigation is, we're standing here on our timeline and I'm looking backward into the past and trying to figure out what happened. So I'm looking at the evidence. I'm talking to witnesses. I'm piecing together this puzzle of what happened in the past. That's really all that I'm doing. And I'm plotting it on a timeline. Intelligence is the exact same thing, only we're looking into the future. We're looking at evidence. We're looking at what people saw, all of those things to try to predict what's going to happen. So it's really the difference on the timeline of which way you're facing. As a private investigator, you're doing the same thing, but it is for a client as opposed to the police. So it may be, the client might be a spouse who thinks that their partner is cheating, which is pretty common, or it could be a defense attorney that is hiring essentially the equivalent of a law enforcement detective to try to find evidence to exonerate their client. So, I mean, it's the same concept of looking backward on a timeline and piecing things together. It's just who you're doing it for.
No, that's fantastic. And just coming back to the kind of trope of the cop character. So we've had the maverick, and of course you worked in narcotics, and everyone's got the trope of the bad narcotics cop with the drugs in the boot of the car, taking all the money from the drug kingpin, whatever. Right. Another trope. So how do we make our cop characters more richer and more three-dimensional without making them alcoholics or dirty cops?
Well, yeah, alcoholism, PTSD, divorce, blown out vertebrae. I like to think that you're a rookie until you have one of these. Two of them makes you a detective.
Wait. What is the blown out vertebrae? Where does that come from?
Oh, so we wear those big, heavy gun belts. And so if you wear that for 30 years, you're going to end up with some sort of spinal damage, or you're wearing a helmet or something. So bad backs.
No, that's awful.
Yeah, exactly. So bad backs, divorce, PTSD, and alcoholism. You're a rookie until you have at least one. You're a detective if you have two. 3 makes you a veteran, and then 4 is a cliche. So, I mean, I guess what it comes down to is that in reality, cops come in all shapes and sizes, ethnicities, gender identities. They're real people. And we all have different strengths and interests and personalities. And the trope tends to be, to use like a sports thing, our heroes want to be the captain of the team, but in reality, all of those positions on the team need to be played. So the way to write more rich characters would be to just as a writing exercise, like wherever you are right now listening to this podcast, if you're sitting across from you on a bus or a train right now, or you're in a coffee shop or stuck in traffic and the next car over, look at the person nearest you and start thinking about what kind of cop would they be? What assignment, based on just the broad strokes that and not stereotyping, but just, this person could never be a cop. Or could they be the most effective cop you've ever seen, because you don't assume that they're a cop. So then start thinking about what kind of assignment would they work? Do they like their job, and are they good at it? What makes them good at it? Or if they don't like their job, or they don't, they're not necessarily excelling, what other position could you move them to? And so that's where the conflict would come of, finding that perfect fit. So for me, like where I was talking about how I spent a decade in one specific position, it was after 3 or 4 different detective assignments where it was like, I found what I love to do. So, if you're really into science, you're obviously going to have a better time, and you're a left brain thinker and you're analytical, and you may have some more of the, real detail-oriented tendencies. You may not excel in a detective role as a narcotics officer because you're constantly on the run. You're dealing with, nasty scenes, because drug users and drug dealers tend not to live in the nicest communities, or at least have the best housekeeping tendencies. But you may be great as somebody in forensics, or somebody that is working financial crimes where you're literally doing, accounting and forensic auditing. So if you were to think about the types of people that would excel at these different positions, you can create, pretty rich characters, but then challenge yourself. Don't fall for the trope. Think of what would be the most outlandish, or the most, that's kind of interesting kind of position. And then, just take the people around you that you observe and plop them down into a police career and see where that little writing exercise takes you.
And it's funny, as you were talking there, I thought, okay, so who's done that? And then I thought Lincoln Rhyme by Jeffrey Deaver is a black quadriplegic cop. I mean, that's awesome. I don't know if Jeffrey just did that, like you said, and went, who is the least likely person to be a cop? And of course, he's a brilliant cop. So that's really interesting. Then I was thinking about the generational differences, because as we discussed before this, you and I are about the same age, right? Generation X. So we didn't have the internet when we were growing up. Cybercrime was not really something that was, necessarily around 25 years ago. But now you've got boomers who are presumably most senior people in the police force. And then you've got millennials who are coming in, and younger people who are just brought up on tech. So what are some of the issues or some of the conflicts that might occur between a boomer character and a millennial character that might manifest?
Sure. So, well, in law enforcement, we tend to retire earlier, just because we tend not to live as long working, or at least I shouldn't say live as long. We don't live as long once post-retirement, but it is definitely a younger person's sport, if you will, when it comes to being effective out on the street. Obviously, the higher up in rank, where you're not, in foot pursuits and that kind of stuff, it's easier to be a little on the older side. But at least in from what I've seen in California, being kind of in between the boomers and the millennials, was one of the biggest defining moments was the Rodney King incident. And so when Rodney King happened, I was still in high school. And then when the trial and the riots happened, I was in college. And so I came out of school and into law enforcement just as this big shift happened, where it was not the old school. There was this expectation for a new type of policing, community-oriented policing that was about getting out of your car and talking to people and making real connections, not just, being the guy that showed up and, beat somebody over the head with a baton. So I'm kind of like the in between group between the one extreme of, the old school cop that, didn't have time to, do any kind of peacemaking stuff. And then on the more younger side, because of not just Rodney King, but Ferguson and all of the other things where the negative side of policing really came to light when it came to, modern media and social media, we now have a generation of cops that are, well, first of all, I don't believe in the millennial stereotype. They are some of the hardest working people that I've seen. I mean, more so than a lot of the people that I've worked with my age and older. But there is also being so plugged in. There is also a concern about overstepping their bounds. So they may be less likely to do what they need to do to end a situation. So that means, they may be reliant upon the tech that's on their belt, like a taser or, something that is going to solve the problem for them rather than actually being comfortable going hands-on with the person and putting them in handcuffs. If you don't get into an argument with a person after you've told them 2 or 3 times. After that, it's time to do your job, not continue to argue and, not avoid the conflict, I guess. So that's one of the little things. But there's definitely a disconnect between the two generations, but we're getting to the point now where those Gen X officers are now becoming the bosses and the baby boomers are enjoying retirement. And then, there's still a few hanging on, but, yeah. So, the millennials are definitely harder working. A lot of times they have more education, but then they also may be too much in their head to put all the thinking aside and actually do what needs to get done. So it makes for an interesting dynamic. But again, that is a very broad stroke and every person is different. So we have a lot of millennials that are coming back from the military that have seen atrocities that I've never seen. So yeah, it's another opportunity for you to create a great character and, kind of explore that and see what their take on the world is.
Yeah, and I think I keep bringing it back to conflict because another kind of trope is the cop versus the criminal, whereas actually there's a lot more layers of potential conflict, even within law enforcement itself, or even internal conflict, which I think, again, the dirty cop taking the drug money is one thing. But one thing else that millennials, I think, have brought into play as well is that they do think differently about some issues, and presumably a lot of the laws that, for example, and again, this is not a political show, but an example of a law, say your immigration policy in your southern states, where law enforcement were doing things that some people didn't agree with. Let's just phrase it like that. Sure. But if a law enforcement officer does not agree with the law, is that an internal conflict that they can ever resolve, or do they just get on and do the job?
Or they decide not to do the job anymore, find another agency to work for. It kind of goes back to the conversation before where I was talking about finding the right fit, not, where we were talking about a job assignment, but the same thing goes with your agency. If you have I certainly have my own thoughts and opinions on what's going on at the border and, the level of compassion that we're currently showing versus, what I think should be done. It's tough to say. And if you're right in the middle of it and it is something that is such an internal conflict, that will be the time where you either need to do something to change that at the the operational level, or you need to remove yourself from it, like change something internally with you. So yeah, there's constant internal conflict. Crimes are broken down not to throw some Latin out there, but essentially crimes are either mala in se, which means they're bad in their body, in the way that they are, or they're mala prohibita, which is they're a crime because we said they're a crime. So like marijuana possession.
Yes.
There's nothing inherently evil about possessing marijuana. It's just we decided that that's something that we want to write a law about or not write a law about. And so, or remove the law, versus something where we would all agree that murder or taking something that belongs to somebody else, that is just inherently wrong. And so if you are in a position where you're having to enforce a law that you may not agree with, it's more often a mala prohibita crime than it is something that is a mala in se crime. In most of the stories that we're drawn to tend to be ones that are more on that mala in se, that visceral feeling of, is there a moral worth to this story that we're embarking on? And it could be that you're trying to right the wrongs from within the agency, which is definitely a David and Goliath battle. But yeah, I mean, internal conflict is real. I mean, and obviously law enforcement, like crime fiction, it is, I mean, when you go to a courtroom, it is the people of the state of California against so-and-so. Just in the title itself, it is conflict, and conflict drives story. So that's the reason why it is such a popular thing, for sure. But anytime you explore something on a deeper level, like with that internal conflict, what's the right thing to do and why did the character take that path? I think that's really interesting.
No, you're right. And I think this conflict idea is so important. And again, as you say, why it's so popular a genre to read. I mean, in Britain, I think crime fiction is probably our number one genre. And true crime in America, I think, is huge. I mean, it's just massive, these books. But again, another layer of conflict and something I'm thinking about. Obviously, I'm in the UK, you're in the US. I have been told at Thriller Fest, I always get people go, is it true that your cops don't carry guns? And I'm like, well, most of them don't, some of them do now, but it's, there are these fundamental differences in jurisdictions. And you just mentioned marijuana. I was in Amsterdam last week and, it's obviously you just do that. It's not, it's part of the culture. It's not an issue. It's not illegal, whatever. So I have an idea. I've mentioned this before on the show, but on a boat, some murders on a boat. I'm not going to get more detailed than that. But you do have a really interesting episode on your podcast about murders on a boat. But I wondered if we could talk about international issues, because it would seem to me in this kind of global world we're in, where we can all fly around the place, what happens when there's international murders, either in international waters or between states, where you have to negotiate with different people to get things done?
That is a great question. So a lot of the laws that, one thing a lot of writers don't necessarily realize is that jurisdiction can often extend beyond the physical borders of the country. So, like, for instance, in the United States, we have federal laws that prohibit certain actions done by American citizens anywhere in the world. So, like the sex tourism, where an American male goes over to, the Asian Pacific and they start engaging in all sorts of vile, disgusting things, even though they may be in another country, the fact that they're an American citizen makes it a crime in American court. So obviously there has to be some sort of international working going on. For the U.S., the FBI has a position that they call a legal attaché, and they abbreviate it, or they kind of shorten it as LEGAT. So you can, as a special agent for the FBI, you can get assigned to London, or you could get assigned to Thailand or whatever, and you're working out of a U.S. consulate or embassy, and your role is to liaise with the local law enforcement. So in that case, if you had an American citizen leave California or New York and go over to wherever, somewhere in the Asian Pacific, and commit that crime, an FBI agent would be involved in getting you arrested locally there, and then extradited back to the United States. The other time that we will see that on the international scale using the FBI at the local level, since I'm a local detective, not an FBI agent, is if I have a murder here in California and I think that suspect fled overseas somewhere, I will, even though it's just a state crime of murder, I will go to the FBI and they will write a warrant, an arrest warrant that's international called an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. So they will take that unlawful flight warrant and essentially flag it in the Interpol system. So one thing to understand about Interpol, which is the International Criminal Police Organization, they're not like a police body that goes out and arrests people. They're kind of like the UN. They're headquartered in Lyon, France, but they kind of work to make a I guess it's their bridging cooperation between police agencies from around the world. And they try to do so as neutral as they can, like avoiding politics and all the other diplomatic stuff. So if you have, a foreign country that needs access to somebody that's here, you try to bridge those gaps using those kind of diplomatic ties at the police level as opposed to the actual diplomacy stuff. So yeah, it can be pretty interesting. And like for the UK, I would imagine that whether it's the Met or the National Crime Agency, somebody I would imagine has a similar program where they have British law enforcement agents around the world to handle the police interests of the UK abroad. So I don't know that for sure, but that's certainly something that writers could research to find out, if you have this transnational or international kind of crime spree, who would really be the players involved.
No, fantastic. And just coming back to the boat, aren't there, from my research, I understand that there are places on the high seas as such that are not anyone's jurisdiction. So what would happen in that instance? So
you would fall under the jurisdiction of where the ship was registered. So if you were on an American cruise liner that's somewhere way out in the Pacific or way down, way out in the Atlantic, you could potentially fall under the jurisdiction of whatever flag that ship is sailing under, or it could be the nationality under the laws of either the nationality of the suspect or of the victim. It really kind of depends. But I would imagine that all of the potential legal jurisdictions involved may end up getting together and kind of hashing it out as to where it's going to go. More often than not, when you have those kind of in-between scenarios, you're going to get more players involved rather than fewer players involved.
Okay. So that could be more painful as opposed to less painful.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you have a ship, like let's say you won the lottery and you have a ship and you decide you're not going to register your ship with any country. I'm not going to fly under a flag so that way I'm not beholden to these countries. The problem then becomes that any country that, if you're in their waters or near there, it's like, hey, we don't know who you are, so we can board you. Yeah. So you bring on more trouble than it's worth.
Well, that's good to know. And it's funny because, of course, I don't want to give away my ideas and everyone's got their ideas. But what I love about your podcast is you're talking about things which can give you ideas. And this kind of reverse design is what you talk about. So you help screenwriters. Now, I'm a discovery writer. So as in I'm a pantser. Mm-hmm. I prefer discovery writer. Okay. So I don't tend to know necessarily what's going to happen. Like when I wrote that crime novel, Desecration, I didn't know actually who was going to do it.
Right.
So, but obviously if you're helping screenwriters, and to be fair, the best crime novels are highly plotted. Jeffrey Deaver, as mentioned, writes like 200 pages of plot before he writes his book. So how do you do this story timeline if you're advising writers' rooms on this plotting idea?
So, well, first, I have nothing against pantser or discovery writers. It's a great way to roll through your first draft to see where your creation is going to go. But ultimately, you're going to get stuck. You're going to get to a point where you've written yourself into a corner and you're like, oh man, how am I going to get out of this? And it's one of those things where this is one of the common scenarios where there is a script in process where a writer's room has all of these things that they want, these scenes that they want to have happen, but then they don't know how to get from A to B. And a lot of times it's a lot easier, kind of like when you were a kid and you were doing the maze puzzle, it's easier to start at the end and work your way back because the branches that go off in a million different directions don't look the same when you're in reverse. So you're kind of reverse engineering the story of, so I will start with, what do you want the end to be? Do you want the bad guy to get away or do you want him to be caught? Okay, you want him to be caught, but not until this point. Okay, so we want it later in the story than what would normally happen in a typical investigation. So we need the interrogation scene to be one where he's not in jail or he's, they don't know if he's done it yet. So reverse engineering the story can be a smart way to kind of make those logical leaps where you've changed the mindset on how you're rolling through the story. And I think we kind of underestimate the significance of working backward in our thinking. This actually goes to the way we tell lies and try to cover them up. One of the techniques that we'll use for interview and interrogation is, I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened, start this morning, work all the way through until you came to the interview room right now. And you're going to tell me your story. A lot of it's going to be a lie. A lot of it's going to be the truth. It depends. But when I ask you to then tell me that story again, but start now and work backward, your brain isn't thinking that way. And so if you're fabricating something, it's going to be really hard to get everything in order. But if you're recalling what you did in order of like, well, I was here, and then before that I was at my mom's house, and before that, it's easy to recall stuff. But if you're fabricating in reverse, your brain has a hard time wrapping the process that way. So similarly, if you're trying to create the story backward, you're not sitting in an interview room with a cop asking you, all of these questions, but it gives your brain the chance to stop and reset and think about, okay, what order did this happen and where, do these little threads go? So that's just one of the techniques.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think the plotting, the threads. So when you talk about timelines, again, in everyone's mind, there's the whiteboard in the at the police station with the kind of the lines on it and the pictures and things. Is that how you do it, or how would you recommend doing that?
Well, I've never been issued a roll of yarn to plot out my stuff.
Why not?
Yes, we do. I will have a dry erase board. Like, I'll occupy a conference room where we've got dry erase boards on the wall. And as we encounter new witnesses or suspects or people, those pictures will go up there. But really, and this is the importance of creating an omniscient timeline as a writer for everything. And what I mean by omniscient timeline is knowing where all of your characters were at what time and what they were doing, where they were. And when those timelines intersect, that's where you're going to have your inciting incident or your interrogation. That's where the conflicts happen, is when those timelines weave. But the reason why a timeline is so important is because that is the true why of your detective. So when I'm going into, like when we first talked about investigations, I'm looking down that timeline into the past of trying to plot out, when did this happen? When did that happen? And that's where I'm piecing together the truth. So when I go into that interrogation, it's not exposition. I'm trying to lock my suspect into a story. He may lie to me. He may tell me the truth. He may do both in the interview, but whatever he says, that's memorialized on that timeline of, you said you were here, and now, regardless of whether or not it's true or not, I'm going to see whether that's true. I'm going to find other ways to determine if you told me the truth for this. And if it looks like you're a liar, that's not going to play out well for the jury. Now, this is where you can, as a writer, can create red herrings, where if I'm in this interview, and I'm interviewing a witness and I'm getting this lie and I don't know why, you may get your reader to believe that this is a culprit because they're lying to the cop. But going back to the why question, what is the why of the suspect? Well, he may not be the guilty party, but he may be trying to hide something else I didn't commit the murder, but I don't want my wife to find out that I was with somebody that I wasn't supposed to be. So I'm lying to you right now because I know she's going to find out if I say anything. So that's kind of where you can create those red herrings that are kind of important to telling mysteries, especially. But understanding that the goal of an investigation is to plot every single thing they can onto a timeline, you really need to do that yourself as the author in order to paint that full picture. And then you can decide when, like if you know that, back in 1982, your suspect was driving an orange, Ford Pinto, right? You plotted that out. That may be something you can reveal as a clue early on in a cold case story and then have it revealed, further on. So it's once you plot out that whole timeline, then you can start playing around with the story as far as what you're going to reveal and when.
And I was just thinking then with the lies, and you mentioned earlier about an interrogation room dialogue shouldn't be the cop telling everything that's happened. It should actually be a whole load of lies and subtext,
right? With
pretty much the cops not saying, this is what happened.
I tend not to ask a question unless I already know the answer, and I'm giving him a chance to either tell the truth, where I'm assessing his truth-telling nature, or he's outright lying to me and I know I'm on the right path. Or, we can end up getting kind of astray by focusing on the lie and not really thinking about why. This kind of, that earlier we talked about the tropes. There's one other trope that drives me nuts, and that is when the detectives walk into a crime scene, they're looking at the body and whether or not they're actually in the crime scene or not, but they automatically have this answer as to what happened. Like there's somebody on scene who's like, oh, this happened and they did this and this, where they pantomime all of the scene of what happened. This is the first 10 minutes you're in a crime scene. If you commit to a story and a narrative in your head, the rest of the investigation is going to be tainted by a cognitive bias of or a confirmation bias, I should say. So, does this evidence support my working theory of how things work? And if it doesn't, then I'm going to discount it. Where in reality, we need that evidence to just empirically stand for itself, and then we can make inferences from it later, not walk into this crime and just automatically assume we know everything, which TV cop shows love to do. And we want our character to be right, and some of the best do it. One of my favorite movies was Heat, but Al Pacino, who's a detective lieutenant, not a detective, again, the rank thing, is standing over a bunch of dead bodies at a crime scene and saying, these are who these guys are. And this is what all of this means. And it's just like, well, that's pretty cool for the viewer to see, but maybe we need to infer some of that and take a step back and not just assume we know everything.
Well, then just on movie, we're almost out of time, but is Seven a good cop movie?
I love Seven. I absolutely
Me
love
too.
Seven. Yeah. And I love David Fincher as a director. Yes, it is. I'd like to think I'm more of Detective Somerset than, or Morgan Freeman's character than Brad Pitt's character. But no, that was a fantastic movie. And in fact, I saw it walked into the theater not knowing anything about it a week after I'd seen Usual Suspects. So I just had this mind blown experience of, finding out the ending. So yeah, doubled down. But yeah, I love that movie. And then the other ones, just if you're going to do your own kind of research, The Wire on HBO was one of my favorites and one of the most realistic cop shows. And then currently right now, Bosch on Amazon. And more importantly, Michael Connelly's books. So if you go back, a lot of times the writers really want to have believable scenes and dialogue and not feel like it's a bunch of exposition. Read the last 2 or 3 books of Michael Connelly's. Read them the first time for the journey and enjoying it. But then second time you go through, start dissecting it as an author. Start looking at the scenes that he includes. And it seems so seamless. 2 characters are riding in the car. They're going from a crime scene to a crime lab.
Does he need that scene? Well, the reason the scene's there is because the conversation is moving that story forward. And if it didn't do that, you didn't need the scene. So he's a real master of that craft. So I like, if you want a master class in telling a detective story, he's definitely the best at it.
Ah, good to know. And of course, he is I think he's the showrunner, or he's very involved with the actual TV series, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's one of the benefits of working for Amazon, I guess, on the studio side. Not to go onto the whole other conversation.
Not a political show.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But no, this is so fantastic. I could talk to you forever. But of course, there is your podcast is available. But also tell us about, there might be a book coming, right?
Yes. So I've been working on a book for about the last year and a half. And then hopefully by the time this podcast airs, it should be up for pre-sale. It's called The Writer's Detective Handbook. And then another great resource that I want to mention real quick is Patrick J. O'Donnell's book called Cops and Writers. It will be out soon. He is a sergeant with a major metropolitan police department in the Midwest, but he's also hosting a police procedural panel at 20 Books Vegas. And so he's asked me to be on it, and we've got Jennifer Servino, who's a defense attorney. We're going to have this whole panel of basically doing the same kind of discussion with the people that are attending 20 Books Vegas. So if you're listening and going to that, please be sure to show up. That would be awesome.
That's November 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So time sensitive, but whenever people are listening, the Writer's Detective Handbook will be out. So where can people find your website and your podcast? And you also have a fantastic newsletter as well. Tell us where we can find these things.
So the podcast is called Writer's Detective Bureau. And the easiest way is for your listeners is to start on my website, just writersdetective.com/podcast. That way they can hear a little trailer of the podcast to see if it's something they want to listen to. And it's also the way that they can send in a question for me to answer on the air. And if you get selected, then I also plug your author page or website or whatever you want. So that's
fantastic. Yeah. Well, that was brilliant, Adam. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for listening this week. I hope you found that interview helpful. Definitely subscribe to the Creative Penn podcast if you haven't already. And to answer the most frequently asked question I received this week on Facebook, yes, there will be a print version of the Writer's Detective Handbook, most likely paperback, hardback, and even large print for those of us that need increasingly longer arms when we're reading. All of those will be made available closer to the publication date in the middle of August. So in the meantime, while you're waiting for the book to come out, definitely send me some questions. You can do so at writersdetective.com/podcast. And if I read your question on the air, I will be sure to mention your author, webpage, or website. So thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.